We will work through the economics of construction theory in here, but it's less about what is a contract and what's a tort and those kind of more legal terms, and more hopefully applicable to your mindset of if you got to open a business and run a business and everything else, whether you're a developer, whether you're a contractor. So this is what's the economy built around for construction. That's what will be today's lecture. So first thing we're going to talk about are types of buildings and the reason for the buildings, and this is kind of more about what you're going to be when there's people out there that are, let's call them developers or owners, and the types of buildings and what the purpose and intent of them are. So this is more theory, but it's kind of the beginning of the basis of the economic equation. Like, why do you have the building, and is the building does it serve a purpose for the economy? Does it serve a purpose for your business? Does it serve a purpose for the public? So the first one we'll talk about here is the buildings whatever the structure is, it's a functional purpose. It's not some type of building that you want that's going to earn money. And so when you're looking at the economics, this is the example when I come to you and the owner comes to the architect and says, I want you to build me a $500,000 home or whatever it is. The economics of that, when you're the architect, is think about what's the revenue driver, what will make sure that I'm going to get paid for my services, because this building is not going to be for business purposes. It's a single-family home, and so does the owner have the funds for it. It could be, on the public side, it could be a courthouse or library. So are there bonds in place? Does the governmental entity, are they approved to do this? Has it gone through, did they do a millage? Like, so where I live, up in Glenview, my kids will ultimately go to New Trier, and there has been, for many, many years, when you go out for the semi-annual votes or whatever, there was a millage to try to have like a huge expansion to the New Trier High School. And they had always tried to get like the whole thing, and it always got shot down, so then they changed it, and it was a much smaller amount, but they did get some renovations. So what is the economic driver there generated through taxes, but what's the purpose? Neither the school nor the courthouse or anything else is not going to earn any money. So that's your first kind of thought process of a type of structure. The second, the purpose is primarily to function, but it also has to make economic sense. Meaning that structure will generate revenue, but it's not its purpose to generate revenue. So here we have a hospital, museum, or nursing home. So they have functionality, like a courthouse and a library has function, or your single-family home has functionality. But the former aren't revenue generators at all. These have some revenue generation, and so when the concept or when the thought process goes in to building one of these structures, and you as the architect and designing and what your thought process is of how much, with the budgets and everything else into the economics, it has to be based through a discussion with the owner as to whether they have the revenue again and what revenue sources does it come from, and then will the building, once it's constructed, perform enough to continue to be sustainable. So, at UIC, when they build a new hospital in that area, or if it's Rush down the street, when they build a new hospital wing, I worked on the contracts for the big giant building at Rush that was built in the last 5 or 8 years. They had to have the donations from the board and from the public, and they had to have approval. But then when the designs went through and the architect looking at it, they had to say, well, this is where it's going to generate revenue. So it has to have its self-sustaining ability once it's built. So that's the second type of structure. And you as the designer, think about that. What am I designing for? That it only functions, or functions that has to generate revenue? What's that in my scope, my program? The third is it functions, and its complete earning, because it is now revenue generation, is through its functionality. And so here we have a factory or a stadium or two examples. So again, you need to think about what you're doing. Like if you think about Soldier Field, that revenue only generates revenue when it's being used, and that's it. So it's not used all the time, and that's the only time it generates revenue. So its ability to function and its functionality are interconnected. a factory. I always have the example of my toy factory or my candy factory that I'm talking about, and that the owner needs to make sure it's up and running by a certain date in order to make the toys to be able to hit the Christmas season, or whatever the example that I give. That is that building's function and functionality and revenue generation and the costs and all those things are all integrally tied. And in fact, when you're working on these types of structures, like a factory or a stadium, what's going to happen, or I do a lot of in the energy industry, one of the economic calculators that they're going to look through is they're going to look over the revenue generation of this facility over a period of time. So let's say we're putting up a wind farm, and each turbine that goes up is somewhere about $1.5 million, and we're going to have 100 turbines in this 75 megawatt wind field. Well, that's $150 million. The owner's not going to have they likely are not going to have $150 million to pay for it cash right away. So what they're going to do is they're going to look at the revenue generation of those turbines for selling electricity to the public over a 30-year period of time. And then they're going to calculate into that also what's the maintenance and upkeep on those turbines, how many times they have to be serviced, how many times will there one that will fail just by, you got 101, maybe 3 or 4 of them fail just because that's the law of averages. All those will be factored in, and then the accountants and the people that are running the calculations to give to the board to approve whether they're going to build this 75 megawatt wind farm is spread out over this 30-year amortized analysis. So it's strictly tied to whether the function and the functionality and the revenue over that period of time. So that's an important, again, for business decisions. And maybe wind farm isn't specifically what the engineers are involved, but you as architects, maybe some other, like a stadium, you'll take that into consideration. How many in a stadium? I mean, how many vendors? How many kiosks? How many this? How many that you'll need, so that they can do projections and forecasts of revenue generation over a period of time. In fact, so there's one of the more famous architectural firms in the country for stadium design called HOK. They do lots and lots of stadiums all over the nation and all over the world. They have divisions. They have people that work in this area that look at what the revenue generation of that stadium can be based on the different types of food services that they can install. And that analysis is a service that they provide to the owner, in addition to designing a really cool looking stadium and making sure you have good sight lines and enough bathrooms. They're also going to give, as an additional service to the owner, projections of food and drink revenue generation over a period of time to help bolster why the design should be what it is. They will help guide the owner. This many skyboxes generates this much revenue, this much functionality, those types of things. So that, again, when you get out there and you're the designer side, you may not find yourself on the boards. You may be someone that's interested in crunching numbers, and that may be an area that you could work with. And this would be like number 3 as far as this type of building, is the factory and stadium of the function and its functionality. And then finally, the last one, and we'll talk much more about this toward the back part of this lecture, is it's an investment vehicle. So now, it's not only will the building function, but you as the developer owner are doing it as an investment. Housing is the best area you can do that. I mean, even if you're single family, like you buy a house, you're probably going to hopefully sell it at a later point for more than you bought it, and the value of the house will increase more than the cost of living. So you buy a house for $400,000, and in 3 years you sell it for $500,000. Well, you made $100,000 on the house, and the market didn't go up that much, so that's cash that has an investment. Obviously, if you're doing condos or apartments, that's a much bigger economic investment. Same thing with office buildings, commercial buildings, and otherwise. But the building itself generates revenue for you as an investment vehicle, versus you are the party that, in the third example here, running a factory because that's your business. So, does that make sense for all these pieces, the different elements of the different types of structures? Good. Okay, next. Motives. Why are you doing what you're doing? So you have the profit, free market versus social good, controlled economy. So in this economic question, regardless, let me let Summer back in. Are you back, Summer?
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know what happened.
That's all right. Sorry I dropped you. I didn't see you drop there, but I got you back in. So again, regardless, and this is what I was talking about on the previous page, regardless of whether you're doing it for free market investment, you have a factory or other thing, or social good, you're building a museum or for people to go to or something to that effect, which is your social good. The motives of why you're doing this, why you're building this, has to make sense. You have to have the economic motive of that. If you want to lose, if it ultimately is losing money, it doesn't matter what your motive is. It doesn't matter what the good of the building is or why you thought it was a really great idea. It didn't work. The economics didn't work. And so if you take a look, and this is when you start to look at areas where they become degentrified or they become not the best neighborhoods. You know, like if you want to think about it, years ago there was Cabrini Green and there was all those projects that were built, and those were pitched as a good economic viable motivator. What they were saying is there was too many people that couldn't afford living, so we're going to build these towers, these high-rises where people could afford to live, and it would give some place for them and protection and develop a community. And that was the intent. And there was social good built into that. But at the end of the day, the areas became unsafe, and there was not the money, the economics were not put in to making it an optimal community. The designs themselves, the way that the structures were built in Cabrini Green, and a lot of these projects, the housing that puts together when you have multi-unit housing and how high-rise multi-unit housing and how they don't lend to communities and everything else. But they economically, as far as the cost to build them, made sense. Economically, in theory, the cost of maintaining and therefore what you had to charge for rent made sense. But the design in how society works didn't make sense. And so then the economics failed because people wouldn't spend the money to put in there, they didn't spend the money to maintain, and the buildings failed and the structures failed. So this is this whole, whether it is for profit, you want to put up a apartment building that's going to make lots of revenue because you're in a really nice neighborhood, or you want to put up social good because you're trying to help people out, you still have to make sure that the economics work and why they work. So how do you get into that? What do you do in the beginning? Who's the parties that are involved? And so your key players here are your developer, market analyst, and your mortgage lender. Now the developer, we have this considered as an owner. Developer could be the city of Chicago. It could be any municipality. It could be a school district. It could be an individual. It could be a business, an LLC, or anything else. But the developer, we're going to call them the owner when you look at construction contracts. If you think about the agreement we just went through, the B101, it's an owner-architect agreement. Owner, in quotes there, could be the city, could be a community, could be a school district, could be an individual, could be business. So that's what the owner is. And they're the first party there. And they have the obligations of the owner in the contract. They have to pay the bills, and they have to make sure the project is being built properly and everything else. And they have to bring in the contractor and the architect to bring their vision or their reason for the building to life. So then there's the next question is the market analyst. They're going to assess when and where, what and why regarding the development of building the project. They're looking at the market-related factors. Should we build a brand new stadium? Do we need a new hockey rink or a new football stadium or a new whatever it is? Should we build the project? How do we build multi-unit living in what area? So this market analyst is going to look at the market, they're going to look at the cost, and it depends on what you're building for. It depends on, if we go back, which one of these four intents, which one of these types of buildings will this market analyst be assessing, and will they be working for it? If you're there for investment purposes and you want to build condo high-rises, they're going to do that type of assessment. If you want to have a really nice house, they're going to do that assessment. So your market assessment analyst is going to look at factors not only related to the specific building, but all the factors that factor into what you want as the owner-developer, what the society wants, what the ultimate end goal here is. And then finally, you're going to have this third, another party will be the mortgage lender. The mortgage lender here is going to be, could be a bank, but it could be also bonds if you're in the governmental field. It could be donations if you're a 501c3, like a not-for-profit organization, or it could be a foundation. So I've done work for various foundations where the benefactors, or not the people that have started the foundations, have funded it, and that foundation will have their own fundraiser, and it becomes its own self-sustaining entity. So it generates revenue itself, and then that is going to be the entity that will pay for the ultimate structure. So the mortgage lender, as a generic term, is pretty much anybody that has the finances for it. Sometimes the mortgage lender and the developer are the same. So like my undergraduate was University of Notre Dame, and Notre Dame has done lots of construction over the years, and they have a standard policy that they will not build a building ever. They will not approve it until it is 100% financed, meaning they have the money in an account to pay for the structure of the building. Now that doesn't mean that if they're going to build, so like they did a stadium renovation about 8 or 10 years ago, which ultimately was about $450 million. That doesn't mean that they had $450 million in the bank sitting there when they started construction. But what it meant is they had money invested with banks and other lending institutions that would generate its own revenue. They had a good bulk of that $450 million already tucked away, but it in and of itself generated revenue. Plus, they had their own funding drives for people to donate to help build the new stadium. So that that there was never any time that they would have to borrow money, technically, from a true bank to pay for that building. Different businesses do it differently. A lot of times companies build buildings and do construction projects based purely on debt and make loans. So it all kind of depends, and hoping, if we go back to this slide, that hoping if they generate revenue and that when they borrow, that the money that they spend, or the money they borrow to build the building, because it's an investment vehicle in this intent number 4, will generate revenue once the building is operational to pay off the mortgage loan. So it just kind of depends on your philosophy as the owner-developer of how much you interact with the mortgage lender and, again, the market analyst. So these are points and questions depending on where you go when you get out and practice. Some of you guys may never practice for an architectural firm. Some of you may go out and work directly for a developer. Or some of you may work for an architecture firm and switch to a developer, or go work for a contractor. Or some people may ultimately, when they work for the architectural firm, provide some of these skills and services in these key players and wear different hats of advising what type of project and why you want to have a project and where it'll generate revenue. So that's why I kind of want to introduce you to these concepts here of key players. Ownership. So the ownership, those are the parties, doesn't necessarily mean the owner. It could be the owner in the beginning, and the owner then turns over the ownership of the building. So if you think about a condo association, or that so you have a developer that builds the building, and then once the building has, I can't remember if it's 2/3 or 3/4 in the state of Illinois, but once the condo building or condo association has the 2/3 or 3/4 of actual individual owners that now owns the unit, then the developer turns over the ownership and care for the building to the condo association. And there are transactional documents that talk about that turnover and who has obligations. In fact, I just got pulled into a lawsuit a week ago where there's a homeowner association that has lots of problems with the building. Some of them are structural, construction related, some are architectural design related, and other are operation and maintenance related. And when the the condo association or the homeowners association took over the building, the developer made certain promises that with respect to operating expenses for a certain period of time and covering certain types of expenses, the developer would pay for the majority of those costs. Not forever, but for a kind of a phased-in period. And that's part of the deal that the developer struck with the homeowners association. The homeowners association generates its own revenue by picking up assessments from the people and the homeowners and everything else, but that doesn't mean that the developer's out. So the care of the building is shared between the homeowners association and the developer for a certain period of time. And we're in a lawsuit right now over those operating expenses. There's a second lawsuit over the design and construction defects, and that's just the building is falling apart and you guys didn't design or build it right. But the care and operation is this, when we get into these players, is the ownership. That's what you want to think about. Once the building is constructed, the ownership concept here is care for the building. So, do you have an apartment building where the landlords don't maintain? Are they using that apartment structure as a revenue generator, as an investment, but the way they make the most buck, the most dollars, is they put in the least amount of upkeep? And that's what happens in a lot of buildings where it's not a condo when you sell off, but in fact the owner developer continues to own it and doesn't do what the tenants want to do. That could be a problem. So like slumlords or whatever. But then condo boards will also sometimes hesitate to spend. They want to wait for the rainy day. I lived in a condo association and we were a bunch of townhomes. And the two people that lived next to me were actually the two principal realtors for the development, and then they ended up finding themselves on the board. And they went in, and there was lots of things that needed to be done to upkeep, and they didn't want to spend the money on it because they also wanted to have, their thought process was, if we show that we have a healthy reserve, lots of money because we're collecting assessments from our condo association members, that when we want to sell, when parties want to sell, because remember they were the main realtors, so when they wanted to sell a unit, and they would be the realtors for that, and they would make commission, it would be more attractive to prospective buyers because there was more money sitting in the reserves. And so they'd pick up and they'd approve, we'll make sure everything looks painted and the flowers are all right so it looks pretty. But if there were some major repairs, which there had been some issues with the roofs, they didn't want to spend that money because it would have brought down the reserves. So we actually had to kick them off the board because we didn't think that they were doing what was best for the condo association. They were doing what was best for we felt, for their pockets because they were going to make more money on a sale of a unit than keeping the units up and running for us individually. So that's something to think about in the owners. And then the condo litigation crisis I have here, the reason why I raise this just as part of your thought process in the economic equation, is that and I have this second bullet. I have, like I told you, I just got brought into this lawsuit last week. So many condos were built. Now people are mostly building apartments, but if you go back into the 2000s and the early 2010s, people were building condo after condo after condo after condo, and because the money was cheap, it was easy, there was a lot of work, and so developers, to make money, and we'll get to this equation shortly, they cut corners because the cheaper you build the building, but the more you sell those condos for individually as an apartment you rent, but you sell those condos, you make more money. And the thought process was, is once I sell it, I'm out from under it. I don't have to worry about it. It's your problem. I've given it over to you. You got everything else. Well, what's come back to kind of bite them is that the buildings are crappy, and the homeowners associations do have legal rights. And so they get into lawsuits with the owners, with the developer. So the homeowners association sues the developers, and now you have developers scrambling because they may or may not have built a good building. But then the flip side, which is where the second bullet comes from, and this is the case where I'm in, sometimes you have lawyers But you see this kind of as the golden calf, this condo association litigation. So we represent a developer that built I don't know how many unit high-rise here in Chicago, and there was problems with, like I said, there were some discrepancies on the operation and maintenance side under who was supposed to pay for those maintenance agreements and keeping the building up and running on the turnover. And then there were some construction defects, not bad, minor, a little bit here, a little bit there. And there was a claim for about $1.5 million to get everything fixed. It was not moving along very quickly. I think the owner and the board got frustrated because they weren't getting those $1.5 million items fixed. So they went out and hired a new set of lawyers. These lawyers have come in the last year, and the lawsuit's gone from $1.5 million to $41 million. And everything you could ever imagine they are asking for. And so they have kind of created this, what I think is going to be a problem for everybody is, like one of the issues is there's some windows that have cracked, a handful of windows that have cracked, and they're not working properly. And we've replaced some of those, not all of them. Well, the new lawyers have come in and said, we want the entire curtain wall, the entire surround of the entire building. And this is probably a 25, 30-story building. We want every single window pane replaced, which is about $37 million of the $41 million. So now we have a condo board who are freaked out because 10 or 12 windows have cracked, and they're thinking, oh my God, we have to replace the entire building. And what will that do to us? And how much will that do everything else? But you have the lawyers for the plaintiffs, for the condo board, saying, but this is what you need to do, and we can use this leverage. And what my client, the developer, is saying is, well, wait a minute. Now I'm looking at a $40 million lawsuit. Why do I have to pay all that? Like, this is, there's insurance and everything else, but it's the whole thing. When you negotiate to settle a $40 million case versus a $2 or $3 million, even $1.5 million, whatever it was earlier, it's just so much harder. And especially like if the lawyers, sometimes these lawyers are working on a contingency. Well, if I settle a $40 million lawsuit for $25 million, and I get a third of that, that's a lot more money because I started with this huge number. That's a lot more money in my pocket than if I was just representing them on a $2 million lawsuit, because I settled that for one. So I don't get much money off of that one, but I get a lot more money if I go with this huge. So there's a lot of things that go on, and I'm not saying, because I don't know enough about the case, I just got in, I'm not saying that's the facts here, but there's tons of those things happen, that lawyers step in. I'm one, so I have no problem criticizing my fellow lawyers, but sometimes they step in and they make a mountain out of a molehill, and that's not the best for anybody, whether it's the homeowners association or the developer or otherwise. Okay, a couple other things that you want to think about, some key terms in when you're doing your analyses. So you're going to put together a pro forma, and before you build a building, before you develop, whoever you are, you're going to look into three main factors. It's this pro forma, which is Latin for the same for a form. It's a financial document. And pro formas can be very complicated, very detailed. I'm just going to give you the three big bullets. Three things you're going to look at. What are the costs to develop the building? What are the expenses to keep the building operational? And what's the income that the building's going to generate? Okay? So costs and expenses are different. Costs are what it costs to build. Expenses are for running. So we'll talk about those. So how do we do? Let's kind of break those down. So the cost. What's the cost? Let's talk about an apartment building, because that's what we're going to do in our little when we do the calculations coming up. So let's do apartment building. So your cost as a developer, someone who's going to build this apartment building, hire an architect and everything else, you got your land acquisition, your local costs, utilities and those types of fees, permits and otherwise, your construction cost, how much is it going to actually cost, the cost of the work, if you remember from the B101, your FF&E, your fixtures, your furnished equipment. So cost of the work may or may not include FF&E. So when you come in and when you're building a hotel or you're building here an apartment building, obviously all the units are going to be empty, but you got to put in refrigerators. That's not part of the cost of the work. That's just something that is equipment that goes in. Every unit has to have a refrigerator, a dishwasher, or what have you. And or the lobby has to have furniture, or let's say that the apartment building has a dry cleaner. You have to have equipment in there or something to that effect. So that's FF&E, that's a cost. You got to pay your architect and engineer. If you're going to have an owner's rep, somebody that's going to help you during the construction, the developer, that's another cost. Your own internal project managers, your owner's rep. Legal expenses, you got to pay me. You got to have me involved. I got to write contracts. I got to make sure that the project doesn't go off the rails. Counting expenses, and then your miscellaneous costs, surveying, everything else, marketing, because you want that apartment building, you want people to move in, your research and so forth. So that's your total project cost. And then you're going to ultimately have a construction loan, most likely, when you build this building. You're going to build a $100 million building, you got to get a loan for that. Most people don't have $100 million laying around to do an apartment building, so you have this project cost. And so the interest on that construction loan is a cost. So that's all part of the cost in developing that building. And you have, ultimately, that's your total cost. And then you minus your mortgage value, because the mortgage on your loan, and whatever the delta is. So if your total cost of that building is going to be $15 million, and you have a mortgage for 12, your equity in that building is going to be $3 million. And that's at the beginning. That's your mortgage value equity analysis. Okay? Any questions on cost? Okay, your expenses. What expenses come in? And these are, like I said, after construction. Once the building is done and up and operational. And so if you're doing an apartment building, you as the developer also more likely than not will be the owner. So you'll continue to... I have one of my partners, but I work with this client as well, has a client that for many, many years built condo buildings, and they would sell the units and then move on to the next condo buildings. Fewer people are buying condos, more people are using rental from apartments. So they're building apartment buildings, and then they will then sometimes keep those and manage and operate those, but more often than not, they will build an apartment building and sell the entire apartment complex to someone who's in that business. And so the owner may or may not be the developer, depending on if the building was build to suit, build to sell, build to operate, whatever it might be. But these expenses are what comes into your pro forma. Utilities, gas, oil, water, electric. Your operations, you got to have people that help run and operate the building. Your overall repair and maintenance. These are all on an annual basis. All these things are going to be budgeted on an annual basis whereas the construction costs will be for the project itself, whether it takes 6 months or 6 years. That's a cost is tied to the project. Expenses are tied on an annual basis. Management office, marketing, insurance, real estate, miscellaneous. So those are your operating expenses, plus your mortgage retirement. So if you go back here you had interest on the construction loan. Most often when you're doing a construction project, you get a construction loan, and more often than not, unless it's a long project, the bank will only require that you pay interest during the project on the loan. You do not have to pay off the principal. However, when the project is finished, that construction loan will be converted into a more traditional loan, and that will have a mortgage, and you will be paying your mortgage retirement, which is money paid toward the principal and interest. And so since we've gone from a cost of interest on the construction loan to mortgage retirement on the traditional loan, that becomes, again, an annualized expense. Okay? Any questions on expenses and the difference between costs and expenses? Good. Last component you're going to do when you put together your pro forma is your income. Okay, and you're going to do this income analysis, you're going to do that in the beginning, and then before you even build it, and you're going to do an expense analysis when you do in the beginning, because you're going to, as I said, like when I was talking about those people that put up like a wind farm or other factories or facilities, they're going to look at that expense analysis over a period of time and amortizing the value so they can pay off the loan for the retirement and everything else. So part of that you'll be doing is on your income generation. So since we're here on an apartment building, you're going to look at your rental income from the apartment. And then leases, depending on what you have on the first floor, you're maybe going to have various commercial leases. One of the things that has been obviously very devastating to people during the COVID time is there are plenty of apartment buildings, obviously, where people can't make a rent, and that's one thing. But there are other places where people like us or what have you are still living in their apartments and have enough revenue generating to pay their rent, but the stores that were on the first floor that had walk-in food or had yoga studios or whatever, that they had all these first floor leases, a lot of those closed. And so people that are landlords, that are owners of buildings, their pro forma got skewed, and it's not because, and yes, many of them got skewed because of inability to collect rent from the unit owners or the unit renters, but also really from the leases of the commercial spaces, which has been, kind of obviously very devastating. Another income is garage rental. Especially if you think of here in Chicago, like renting a garage space is huge. If you can get a indoor garage without being parking on the street or otherwise, so that's another income. So that's your gross income, and then you have to subtract from that gross income how much revenue you're generating on a monthly and annual basis, the vacancies. And that's the one thing, as I was talking about, of these commercial units below, those vacancies were not nearly as traumatic to the equation as they are now. But certainly, you're going to look on a non-COVID year in the regular world, how many of my units, if I have a 100-unit apartment building, what's the percentage of vacancies that I'm going to have at any given time? 4%, 10%? And that's what your market analyst is going to look at. She's going to look at it and going to do an analysis and say, if you build an apartment building here, it's overgrown, it's overbuilt, so you're going to have tough time renting it out. If you put one here, you may have less problems and so fewer vacancies. So when you do your pro forma analysis, you want to make sure that you take that into consideration for your net income and cash flow. Okay? So, what do we got here? We got net income, your annual net income, minus your total expense equals your profit. Now here's the interesting thing, if you want to go back one slide here. If you take a look at this last line item here where it talks about this mortgage requirement, as I said, the construction loan, you paid more likely than not interest only, and when the building was completed, it converted to a mortgage, a traditional mortgage. So while you may have spent $15 million on the building, it's not, when you get into this calculation here, that $15 million is in this box of total expense here, because that's your mortgage retirement is in total expense. So the value, the cost, so that's why we don't have net income minus total expense minus cost, because your cost, once the building is completed, is assumed into an expense over the mortgage retirement. So, net income minus total expense is your profit. Your profit equals your percentage of equity in the development. Is that making sense? Okay. And the hidden quality here, and this is where your market analyst research here, is growth. Your total expense will probably stay closer to the cost of living. The curve on the total expense should remain consistent with what's going on in society in general. Your net income hopefully increases at a higher rate. That's your growth, which gives you a greater profit and a larger percentage of equity. And that's when you calculate to get what's your return on investment. So if you have a $50,000 investment and the growth goes to $1 million, you have a 20 times return on investment. If you have $100,000 invested in a project and the growth is $1 million, you have a 10 times return on investment. What's this investment part? Well, let's say that you had a construction loan for $15 million and only invested $100,000 of your own cash. But when you go through the calculation, because remember the retirement of the mortgage is in net and total expenses, when you go through this calculation, if your profit and your growth gets you to the million, that's why you get your return on investment over your initial investment. So that's why real estate over the years has been a very profitable market for people is that you don't necessarily have to put in a large investment to have a great and expansive return on investment. There is, however, obviously the risks, because you're taking somewhat of a flyer, somewhat depending on your analysis and research, on what is the growth percentage. What's the hidden quantity? Will you get a large return on your investment to help you pay off your mortgage and your total expense because the income is increased, therefore increasing your profit? So that comes into a developer's thought process. Where can I spend the least amount of money to develop the most and have it generate in an area that grows? Okay, one example, we'll go to the next slide. So I represented a developer many, many years ago, and he worked in a lot of what's called assisted living housing. So it would be low income or people that were of senior or elderly status, but they didn't have much revenue generation themselves. And so he was able to get loans from the federal government and the state and local government here to build apartment complexes for assisted living. Some of them he took old buildings and renovated them. They were like historical buildings. Other ones he built from scratch, ground up. And what he would do is he would go out and he would purchase land in very sketchy neighborhoods that literally, sometimes it was for $1, he'd get an entire city block. And the reason why he would get that is because there was taxes to be paid, and it was an empty block, and they had torn everything down because the growth in the area was bad and otherwise. So this guy developed some properties actually over by the United Center, a little bit north, and just a little bit east. And he was taking, this was many years ago. The United Center was up and running, the Bulls were still winning, the Hawks were just kind of starting to come into their own, but the area was rough. It was very bad at the time. But things had started being pushed. They started pushing from the city, and they were now starting to move west of Halstead, and then they kept going further and further west, and as you continued down Madison Avenue, there was a lot of these old more warehouse-type buildings that were being developed into apartments, and there was grocery stores coming up, and I'm sure if you guys, it's not too far north of where you guys are on the other side of the expressway, there were some nicer neighborhoods that were coming into play. And so he had very, very little of his own cash invested. He had lots of his own time and sweat equity, but he had very little invested in his cash, and he was able to get a variance on his what he had to build. So he built, I think it was a 40-unit single structure building. It wasn't high, it was like mid-rise. It had 40 units in it. And then he built 32 townhomes. And each one of the 40 units plus 16 of the townhomes, the revenue that he could charge for rent, because it was going to be rental, was subsidized by the federal government, and so he only could charge a certain level to the people in the public. So they were for people that didn't have high income. And so his net income was going to be low, because for the bulk of the development, he was getting very low rental rates. But his total expense was next to none, because he built it based on loans and tax credit deals. As long as he was operating under certain type, other people paid for it. Plus, of the 32 townhomes, 16 he was able to sell at market price. So they were being built by subsidized money, but because of the variance, he sold those at market. So he sold those actually at a pretty high figure, which reduced his costs and his expenses. And so at the end of the development, his return on investment was well over 20 times, because he had 32 units of townhomes and 40 units of apartment complexes over a 2-city square block over by the United Center. But as the neighborhood changed, it became much more valuable. So for very little money he put in, he got a substantial return on investment. And the plan, and I think he's actually probably beyond the window, after a certain period of time, it's 8 or 10 years, he can then sell the first 16 units that were at government subsidized. He can start selling those actually now at full market rate. And he owns those because they're rental units now, and he can sell those at full rate to people who want to move into them and not have to have subsidized anymore and make even more money on it. So It's an interesting way to think about certain ways to generate revenue where you have very little to no expense, and even though you have very little to no income because it's low-income housing, once your equity goes up, it can be worth millions. So, the biggest area right now in the city is Lincoln Yards, and I have one of my good friends is actually going to be building 1,200 low-income housing units on that. And after 10 years, it'll probably be worth to him probably $100 million. It'll be huge. So it's a very kind of wild analysis. All right, here's the promise, the numbers. So I'm not going to ask you to do the math, but I'm going to run through here what we've just talked about, this cost, and we're going to go through the concept of how you're going to pay for this 100-unit 100 two-bedroom apartments. It's 12 to 14 stories. There's 100 units. They're 1,200 square feet. So for this analysis, everything's the same. It's not some single units and double units and different sizes and everything else. It's going to be as standard as can be so you can understand the process here. So I'm going to just walk through this pro forma, this analysis that you're going to go through first so you can understand, is this a profitable venture? Should I get into this? And this is what a developer is going to do. And for purposes of the exam, again, I'm not going to ask you to run through calculations and numbers, but I want you to understand, is there a reason for having a process like this, and then what falls into what categories? You know, like, is land a cost or is it an expense? Is marketing a cost or an expense? Is it a soft cost? So that's what I want you to kind of think about here, but I'll run through it. Okay. So this is the construction side right here. So this first page is all construction. These are considered costs. You have your hard costs. Land, building. The building is broken up into your units, the circulation, that's your hallways, the common areas, that's your, the garage and their lobby and everything, and then commercial space. So that gives you your total of your square footage. So we have the land, it's $25,000. And you have 12 units, that's what your cost. So this is, the land is worth, what you're going to say is you have to pay $2.5 million, okay? The building, your square footage, this is your calculation, your total square footage. Your total square footage here is 159,000 square foot plus the garage. So that gets you to what is your per square footage cost, okay? So we have 159,000, you're going to design, and this is your design. You go to the architect and say, I want the units to be roughly a value of $135 per square foot. So like a high-end luxury apartment will be $600 to $1,000, something. 135 is pretty bare bones, pretty straightforward, okay? And nothing special, nothing fancy. It's probably going to have tile floors instead of hardwood floors or what have you. But you're going to say, design me 159,000 square feet, that's the building itself, at $135 square foot. Your garage, I need it to be, that's going to be about $70 per square foot for your concrete and your heating and your garage door and whatever else is in. So your total hard cost, you buy the land and the cost to build the building based on the design. This is your budget, these two numbers, the $21,000 and the $2.4 million. $21 million and $2.4 million, that's your budget. Your total hard cost budget for the construction is going to be $23,915,000, okay? Now you're also going to have soft costs. Remember, the cost of the work doesn't include like architect's fees and legal fees and everything else. So these are outside of what we had defined in the contract as cost of the work. So you have the construction loan. Well, you got a loan on $23.9 million, 7% interest. Remember, you're only paying on the interest. That has a calculation. And then a lot of times it's cut in half. So after halfway through of paying for it, it draws down progressively. That's just a calculation in the bank. So when you do the math, your cost during the construction is about $837,000. Lender's fee, their closing points, another $358,000. Architect's fee at 4%. That's very low, but let's just keep that there for this analysis right now. $956,000. You got to pay me $50,000. You got to pay marketing $50,000 and miscellaneous. So your soft costs are $2 million. Your hard costs are $23.9. So your total project cost is $25.9 million. That's your total project cost. Cost of the work, $23.9. Total project cost, $25.9. Okay? These soft costs, as you can see, are not considered part of the construction loan. So this is going to be your investment. Somewhere along the line, you're going to have to come up with the $2 million. That's your investment into the property on your own, because the construction loan is only 23.9. Does that make sense?
I have a question about
All right. Income. So now the apartment's up and running, so you got to figure out your income. Am I charging the right rent? Again, this is analysis you're going to do first. Am I charging the right rent? So let's go with this then. Let's start with a number. Let's say I'm going to charge $1,600 a month for rent for 100 units in 12 months. So that means I'm generating $1.9 million of revenue for income for apartment rent. I'm also going to rent out my 100 garage spaces, so $200 a month. That's another $240, and then I got $100,000 for the dry cleaners and whatever else is, the yoga studio in the first floor. So my annual revenue is $2.2 million. Now I'm going to have a vacancy of about 5%. Let's just be real that we're not going to always be renting out every apartment for every day for every month. So there's going to be some vacancy, so I'm going to put in a 5% vacancy based on my market analysis, so you guys take that away. So my total income is $2.147 million on an annual basis. Now, I got to run the building. We're up and running, so I'm going to do an analysis of my expenses. So my management, I got salaries of my management team, my super, whoever's there. I got utilities, I got maintenance and everything else. And what you try to do is you take a good swag here, because you may not know exactly what these are. You say, management is probably about 40% of the income. So I got an income of 2.14. I'm going to times that by 40%. So I got annual expenses of about $158,000. Mortgage retirement. Remember, now here, this mortgage, I have a mortgage of $25 million. So maybe what you did, and let me go back one slide. This is what happens when you close on a building in the developer world. So the construction loan up top in soft cost is $23.9 million based on your total construction costs. You have to come up, as I said, with this $2.049 million for the total soft costs. Now what you may end up doing is you may have to end up taking another loan separate from the construction loan for that $2.049 million, because you don't have $2 million sitting in your pocket for that year that you're developing. So you have a secondary loan on that. When the project is completed and you have your total cost of $25.9 million and you close on the building, what you do as a developer is you go back to the bank that gave you the construction loan and you refinance that and you combine that. Remember when I said expenses is your mortgage retirement. So you're going to combine those two, which leaves you to your mortgage now of $25.9 million. It's not the $23.9 because that was just the construction loan. Now it's the full loan for the full building. So now you're not out of pocket, other than here, probably what it looks like is this person has 15% equity in it. So the mortgage retirement is 85% of this. So you have the $22 million that they owe left on the mortgage at a 6% interest. However, I can't remember where I came with that number, but this is when I put this formula together. So that mortgage retirement on an annual basis is $1.3 million, leaving you with total expenses of $2.182 million on an annual basis. And we all know what the next slide is going to show. You're losing money. Your revenue and income 2.1, 2.14. Your expenses 2.18. You are losing $35,000 a year. So while you had a 15% equity in it, which your equity value is $3.8 million, that's about 1%. Your loss on an annual basis is 1% of your equity in the building. And so that means you're losing 1% of equity every year. So the next year that 15 will go to 14, and after 15 years you will have zero equity in that building because you are not charging enough rent. So this is not a good market. This is not a good analysis. You got to go back to the drawing board and say, I can't do this. And the question is, can you charge higher rent in the neighborhood, or do you need to find a different place to build it? So that's part of your market analysis. That's part of that $50,000 of marketing expenses goes to when you're doing this first initial pro forma. Is the economic equation here correct? And the answer, because it's in red, is no. You don't want to build this building in this area. So is this making sense? Like I said, I know I'm doing math here and everything else, and I don't want, again, don't worry about the math, just worry about the high-level concepts here of income, expenses, and how you generate and where they fall in the buckets. That's all I need you guys to think about here for the exam purposes, and just in a bigger picture, when somebody comes and asks you when you're out there as an architect, you'll know a little bit more about that. All right, so let's do this again. Same thing. All I did was raise the rent from $1,600 to $2,000 a month. So now you're generating $2.4 million. You have the same cost everywhere else. Your vacancy is a little bit higher because 5% of the $2.4 million, as opposed to 5% of the $2.1 million, gets you to the 137. I think the other one was 113. Now your total income is $2.6 million a year, just for a little bit more rent. Same calculation. Now, if you remember on the expenses here, this was $858. Now it's jumped up to $1.4 million, or $1 million from $858 to $1 million. So it went up by $140,000. The reason why it did was because it's 40% of the 2.6, not 40% of the 2.1. So that's why this has gone up. The mortgage retirement is going to stay the same, however. Your mortgage didn't change. Your equity didn't change, nor did the annual interest rate change. So this number, the 1.3, is the exact same on in the previous calculation. So what's gone up is your expenses have gone up, but so has your income. So now we have total expenses here of $2.365 million. So we go to the next slide, and you're going to see now you have a gain of $237,000 on an annual basis. That's pure profit that you are making. And what that translates to, if you remember that formula way back like 5 slides ago, it was net income minus expenses equals profit. And profit means equity in your building. So what we have here is you'll start out with 15% equity, but you're gaining $237,000. Your percentage is going to gain. Now, it doesn't go from 15 to 21. It's a 6% of the 15, but you are gaining an investment interest of 6% into your business every year, as long as the market rates, the expenses, and everything else stay the same. And over time, you'll raise your rent and everything else. So this is a good investment. But here it's not a great investment. This is just kind of one more thing on the side. Because there's other places as a business developer where you could have made more money. If you look over the last 25 years, the stock market's raised about 10% over the last 25 years. So that's a good. So it's a good. This is solid. Real estate is stable. If you could have an investment that made 6.5%, 7% every year, it may not be making as much money as you're making in the stock market, but maybe you don't have a couple of stocks that tank. You know, who knew what would happen with COVID? And but people that own buildings, if they've been able to survive and ride this out, maybe in the next 2 years they'll be back where they need to be. So there's lots of things about here. So there are different analyses that you go in as a developer and looking at where do I want to make my money and where am I going to have return on investment. As I said, the developer that I work with that built the complexes over by the United Center, he was in for the long game. He didn't make much money for the first 10 years, but now my guess is he's making lots of money on it. The other buddy of mine that's going to be putting up 1,200 units in the Lincoln Yards development over the next 15, 20 years, that may be worth $50 to $100 million for he and his family, but it's going to take a decade or so. So his gain is probably going to be, the guy that's at the Lincoln Yards is probably going to be much less than 6% a year. He's probably going to be closer to 1 to 2%, but he'll have a gain. But the payoff will be different. So these are all kind of factors you go into in this overall economic equation. Any questions on that? All right. One last slide. This is if you're doing a condo. So remember we were doing, and this is a different analysis, before we were doing an apartment, and that's an annualized revenue generation. Here's a quick pro forma on if you were a condo, because the condo developer builds the building and sells that, and within a short period of time, anywhere between 6 to 18 months, they sell off all their units. And so that's a faster turnaround for profit. So let's look at the same thing here. Let's look at the same calculations. Hard costs, $23.9 million. Soft cost, $2 million. So these are the same as the very first page. Building to building is the exact same cost. Doesn't matter whether it's apartment or condo. Okay? Then they have different costs that you're going to bring in that were not part of your soft costs to increase. And so you're going to have a broker because you're going to now have to sell each and every one of those 100 units. And so the value of the cost, the hard cost of the building, is $23.9 million. The broker's going to make the real estate broker free on closing every one of those. So I'm going to say roughly $1.5 million, $1.4 million. This may be higher because they sell the units at a higher thing. So it depends on what your costs are. But this probably will end up being higher. But you got to think about your real estate broker is going to make at least 5 to 6% on each unit sold. The lawyer, I got to draft your contracts, your real estate, your sale contracts, and make sure everything goes well. I'll probably draft you a standard agreement, and then you guys can handle it. And unless there's anything messy, it's pretty simple flat rate. Surveyor, you got to survey the sites because when you sell a building, each individual unit has to have its own legal descriptions and meets and bounds. So there's some cost for that. So now your costs. Instead of $25.9 million or $27.5 million. So this is your cost to build the building, okay? If it's going to be condo. You have decided you want to make a 15% profit on your investment. It's a one-time profit. So you got to add that in. So total is $31.6 million. So the way to get 15% profit is you have to sell the 100 units for a total of $31.6 million, which is roughly $316,000 per condo. Now, the higher ones may go a little bit more expensive, but remember, for this example, they're exactly the same, so there's not going to be a huge variance. But that's what you want to do, is that you go find, so now what you do as a developer, you say, I'm going to build a building, it's going to cost me $31 million with all the brokerage fees and everything else to build and develop and sell, and included in that is my profit of 15%. Now I need to find a place that I can sell the units at an average of $316,000 per unit. If you're in an area that's really poor, you may not be able to sell for that. So that's not, that market analyst is going to say we can't build it here. You won't get the return on your investment. Maybe you find a place that it's really nice and you have the land. Maybe some costs go up because of land costs, but you'll be able to sell it for a higher profit, so maybe you make even more money. So that's the one-time analysis. It's a different version of what you do instead of an apartment complex. Okay? And that's it. Any questions?